Good morning. On Tuesday, Nico and I set off for our regular daily walk along the creek, Toongabbie Creek, along the highways and byways, if you like, the tracks around Toongabbie Creek. Anyway, we walked through Third Settlement Reserve, and my mind went back to previous years on the 26th of January, when we would walk through that place and it would be filled with people. People on chairs with tables and eating and drinking, a bunting and flags everywhere, a Rotary sponsored barbecue breakfast, some old cars and people dressed up in traditional, Australiana kind of costume, colonial costume. The local scouts and guides doing a flag raising ceremony, and of course the local politicians dropping in on their way through every small gathering in the region, and in between that folksy Australiana music that blared through the speakers, not a great quality, and became very monotonous after a while. On this day, this year, due to COVID-19, it was quiet, no one around. As Nico and I walked through there and then walked down the bush track along the creek, I wondered about those people who had called this home for millennia. What it was like 234 years ago, before the British colonisation of the land. I wondered how the Toogoogul clan lived. I wondered how wallabies or kangaroos or emus or echidnas or wombats, how they roamed the land. The birds, I guess, were perhaps similar, without the minor birds. Cockatoos, parrots, galahs, magpies, kookaburras. The black snakes, of course, and the lizards and other reptiles, water dragons. But how the people lived, where they got their food from. The kids perhaps diving in and out of the creek where there are pools, maybe hunting for eel. How they survived in the cold winter months when it was freezing cold, of enduring the droughts and the floods, of perhaps sleeping in some of the caves along the river banks. What was life like? I wondered this and thought of the stories. At this time around what's called Australia Day, there are many stories, many questions, many struggles coming out between Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and many questions asked. And it's easy to get lost in the big picture stuff, but it's when we hear the particular, the personal stories, that we move from our head to our heart. I remember stories of people like Stan Grant. Stan reaching back and discovering his own family history and talking about it. How they received the Grant name. And up on the hill, old man Grant and his family, the white people and their servants lived. Whilst down below in the camps were the Indigenous people who worked his land and made money for him. They had it hard. They slogged hard for a pittance. But more than that, old man Grant had his way with their women. And so amongst the people who lived on this property were the white Grants, who lived in luxury and splendour in the big house on the hill, and the black Grants, who were ignored and lived down in the camps. For Stan Grant, I suspect this is a metaphor of the story of Indigenous people across the land and their history. A history that's often forgotten. Certainly the stories that I hear these days were not told when I was growing up. And it's important to hear not just the history written from the top, written by those who are in power or privilege, but to hear the stories of the struggle of Indigenous people who have lived on this land for millennia. And so as I listen to Stan Grant, my heart is touched. But others as well. I read recently Archie Roach's biography written with him and about him. This young man, or this young child, very young child, taken from his parents, from his family, and off their land, because he was a bit lighter in skin than some of his brothers and sisters, but also the authorities believed that he could not be cared for in the way that they deemed acceptable. Even though for millennia Indigenous children have been born and raised and cared for by their families. He was placed with a family, a lovely family, and another Aboriginal boy was also placed with them. They had their own daughter. They cared for them and loved them. And he benefited a lot. But at the same time, when he came of age, there were questions and doubts and struggles. There was an alienation within him that he couldn't explain or understand. An alienation that didn't quite make sense. But he couldn't explore it because his story stopped. It didn't have a beginning. It started when he came to this house, and maybe some brief memories before that. There were glimpses in his own distant memory of growing up or of being an infant in another place. But they were raw and subconscious memories. He, like the other boy, left home early and tried to make their way in their world. He discovered brothers and sisters he'd never known, and they established relationship. Some he'd never met, and some died young. And they told stories of his parents and wider family. When he was able to find that land again and discover the house where he was born, some of those ancient memories within him, those earlier memories, stirred. Archie was alienated from himself and lost in his... He didn't have his culture, his language. He couldn't communicate, he couldn't understand. And like so many people, not just Aboriginal people, but other people of other cultures and traditions in other parts of the world, and even here, he turned to alcohol and other substances to numb the pain, to ease the struggle of his life. His journey was difficult and painful. What saved Archie perhaps was a voice of an angel and the ability to write songs and music, and to be accepted because his songs were beautiful. But they told a deep and tragic story, a story that was heart-rending and got beyond the defences of most of us, and we heard and listened. These stories are particular, but they have a bigger, more substantive meaning. And when we hear them and join them together, we hear the pain and the struggle, and we're invited into a new way, which is really what the Uluru Statement of the Heart is about. Not just naming the pain and the struggle, but inviting people in to the journey, to find the answers together and to find a way forward that brings together the wisdom and the traditions and the spirit and the knowledge and the life of Indigenous Australia with what we know in contemporary Australia, white Australia. And into this story this week, Mark tells a story of Jesus. This ragtag new group of disciples follow Jesus, and they wander the tracks and the paths and the roads around the Sea of Galilee and end up in the town of Capernaum. And they go into the synagogue on the Sabbath, and Jesus teaches. And there in the synagogue, the people who gather listen, and they're amazed. And there's stories of amazement that this one speaks with wisdom and authority that their own religious leaders don't have. and don't express, and they're amazed. And in the midst of this story, a man in their gathering who Mark describes as having an unclean spirit, a demon, speaks up and harasses Jesus and calls him names, the son of David, and there's this kind of this to and fro, this I know who you are, and this kind of holding him back and pushing him away, but also drawing him in. And Jesus reacts and responds to this man and calls the demon out of him, names it, names the man's demonic struggle, and cleanses him. And he returns to his right mind and spirit and being. And the people are amazed. They're amazed not just at his words, but his actions. They have authority that they haven't seen before. And at the side, the scribes and the Pharisees and the religious leaders, whoever they are angry. Are angry at what he says and does, because it challenges who they are and their authority. And for Mark, his stories are personal stories. There's a man who is struggling with his demons, much like Archie Roach or Stan Grant or many others. He has his own personal stories and issues. And Jesus touches that life, that pain, that struggle. But for Mark, there is a deeper level of this story. That's not just personal, but political in the deeper, profound sense, not party political, but political in the sense of societal, bigger picture. And Jesus is saying, or Mark is saying in Jesus' words, that the reign of God is not just about the personal, the individual, but it's actually about the world. And that Jesus promises hope. That there'll be transformation of the oppressive systems that dominate this man and his life and the life of the people. The oppressive systems of religious oppression and political oppression through Rome. The oppressive forces of high taxation and legalism, and the wealthy, powerful looking down upon them and keeping them in their place. It's about an alternative vision of the world which releases people through hearing their story and naming the names of the problems of the demons and releasing them into a community that is loving and gracious and inclusive, a community that is healing. Because this is what salvation is about. It's about being released from those things that oppress us, that cause us fear and anxiety, that hold us back. It's about being released into a new way, the way of God. And as I read this story that Mark tells and hear the stories of Stan Grant or Archie Roach or the many others, I hear of the oppressive forces in their lives, the dominant systems that keep them squashed down and push them to the margins often. Not just them, but all sorts of people who are marginalised and pushed to the margins of our world, whether it's refugees that we lock away in detention centres. That little family that have been locked away on Christmas Island for over a year. Why? How is that gracious or compassionate? We are invited into a way that is about grace and love and life. Naming the demons and the things that bind us and that threaten us, that scare us, that hold us back, and allowing God to bring life and hope into these dark places of our communal life, our national life and our personal life. It's about our relationship with Indigenous people and allowing them a voice that will bring only benefit and hope to our land and help us to live more fully and truly on this strange, wide brown land with the wisdom of millennia. It's about how we deal with those who come from other shores, who are in need of care and a refuge from the persecution or struggle of their lives. It's how we develop our relationship with the land itself and the environmental and ecological crisis that we face here and across the world as our planet warms up. And it's how we live with one another, not in conflict and fighting and violence, but in forgiveness, compassion and love. How we can let kindness flow and generosity and peace manifest itself. Because that is what God is on about and calls us into, now and always. And each of us are invited into this journey to become who we can be and to open ourselves to the relationships and community that can help us become more fully the people we're created to be and build a world that is better, more just and equal and fair. Will you join in the journey with Jesus? Amen.